life. As much as anyone else, we support football clubs. As much as anyone else, we go and watch movies. As much as anyone else, we go to university and take part in all sorts of social events and cultural events and activities, and that is good. The one slight concern I have these days is if you go on your Skybox and you go up past the 800s, you have the proliferation of all sorts of Islamic and Asian channels, which at the beginning was welcomed as kind of, this is Muslims getting their own media. But I think it's slightly getting out of hand because there are dozens and dozens of channels. I'm slightly at a loss to explain how you're getting any kind of saturation or coverage. And the other issue is some of these channels are really bad, not just in production quality, but in some of the stuff that's said. So I do worry. I mean, thankfully, my own experience, and you can disagree with me, it tends actually to be most of our parents' generation, elder generation, who are watching these channels, which is less damaging, I suppose. But I would be worried if a young generation of British Muslims are saying, well, all of the media is against us, or all of it's biased, I can't trust any of it, I don't want anything to do with it, it's run by the Jews, etc., etc., and I'm going to go watch the Islam channel, Peace TV, and Dio, or whatever it is. I think that would be slightly dangerous. We don't want to ghettoise ourselves, in a media sense, on top of how we might already in some parts of the country be geographically. That's what I'm slightly worried about. So we actually need to engage much more critically and in a much more nuanced and intelligent manner with the mainstream media. I get worried when I see, I used to work at Sky News. The number of people who would come up to me and say, oh, you work for Sky News, of course, you get your news given to you by Rupert Murdoch and he's Jewish. And I would have to say, A, he's not Jewish, and B, he doesn't give our news to us. But this is unfortunately in our community, sometimes it is a minority, but a vocal minority of people who have certain just uniformly hostile views. And I think both things are bad. The media shouldn't have a monolithically negative view of Muslims, but Muslims shouldn't have a monolithically negative view of the media. I mean, if I believe that, I wouldn't be working in the industry.
Okay,
so just following up on what you just said now, regardless of all the things you have said about what you have seen in British media, I'm not trying to take British media aside, but what I'm saying is, don't you think maybe that the fact that 9/11 happened, and that is obviously, even though statistics don't suggest it, maybe that's a result of people talking more about terrorism. So what if I were to say that after 9/11, there was a lot of news to do with Muslims. Now it's come up to a point where it's not that the media has gotten worse, but more that maybe there isn't anything else they want to. Maybe people expect news to do with Muslims. That's why newspapers publish it. So maybe it's not.
When you say people expect, you mean the general public?
The general public.
It's a good question. A lot of newspapers always hide behind this argument that we're just giving the public what they want. And then sometimes they're right, because if people didn't want to read about Wayne Rooney, they wouldn't buy newspapers about Wayne Rooney. And then we take a very moral high ground. I'm not interested in his private life, because then we all go buy the newspaper, which has the exclusive interview with the woman who, etc. But so it's an interesting point. I don't know empirically whether the right answer. My suspicion is I wouldn't agree with you instinctively. I would say it's probably the other way around, because we have seen a building trend. And I do think there is actually, ironically, you talk about people expect stuff about Muslims. You find other minority communities now complaining that Muslims get too much coverage. There was a group of Hindus complaining to the BBC that you are giving too much coverage to Islam, why are you not covering us? I'm thinking, please cover the Hindus. I don't want this coverage. Any day I'd love to kind of keep my head down and just not have to look at the newsstand and go, oh, what's on the front of the Mail and the Express today or the Times today. It depends how you engage with it. Before 9/11, I suppose, when there was coverage, it wasn't immediately linked to terrorism, but it was still linked to the idea, as I said, of a different sector. As I mentioned, you had these kind of nonsensical pieces from people like Julie Burchill and that Telegraph writer and others, and you had Satanic Verses, of course, which at first, got people thinking in 1989 about, oh, Muslims in our midst, and they're a little bit crazy and they burn stuff. And again, that was one riot with lots of TV crews in attendance, which stigmatised 1.8 million people. So I take the point, but I don't quite agree with it. I do think it is the other. From my experience working in these places, I think it probably is in the other direction.
Okay, from the gentleman with the glasses.
You made some.
Sorry.
There's lots of people in glasses here today.
What, in your opinion, is the most prominent, biggest reason why the West is so Islamophobic? You can pick one.
Well, I think, my short answer would be, Well, first of all, I would question the question. The West Islamophobic. We're using big monolithic terms here. I wouldn't want to say the whole West is wholly Islamophobic. But if you take the drift of the underlying question in terms of why is there this anxiety across certain countries and certain sections of the media about Muslims and Islam, I think it is because Islam is seen as a threat. Rightly or wrongly, and I think that has happened throughout history. And I think on a geopolitical level, there's always been a need for a threat. We had once communism fell, the red threat became the green threat. I think in the media, there's always been a tendency to focus on the other. You look at all these outlets and all these journalists who I've cited who go on and on about Muslims, etc. Most of them also tend to go on and on about immigrants and about gypsies and about etc. etc. There is this idea of the other, and there's a great anxiety right now about in changing population patterns, changing immigration patterns, about what is Europe, what is America, what is our culture, what do we stand for. There's an age of globalization and rapid change. People feel very insecure at times like this. There's an economic crisis in downturns, in recessions, in depressions. You always have countries looking for scapegoats, looking for minorities to blame things on. In the 1930s, it was the Jews. They were responsible for the banking crash, etc., etc. So, there are those kind of the variety of reasons that probably frame some of this debate that says, oh my God. But I think, while that's depressing, I would argue that's probably also a good thing, because that also suggests that we can get through this. I mean, if you place us in a historical arc as a minority community, I would argue, well, wait a minute, the Jews did get through this, and the Jews are fine now. The blacks did get through this. I wouldn't say the blacks are fine now, but black people are much more integrated and much more, black president of the United States, etc., etc. Different communities, the Irish during the Irish terrorism period, if you ask Irish people who lived in London in the 70s and 80s, during internment, etc. I think, if you look back, and I did an interview with Talat Hamdani, who lost her son on 9/11 in this piece. Her son is one of the kind of 30, 40, no one's quite sure how many Muslims died on 9/11, but there were, of course, Muslim victims on 9/11. She lost her son, who was a police cadet, Salman. And she said, she kind of laughed with a kind of sigh, and she said to me, this is our initiation ceremony. This is our way of finding our acceptance. And they're weirdly optimistic. I mean, I thought she'd be really pessimistic. Where do you see American Muslims in 20 years? No, we'll be much more integrated, we'll be much more accepted. Because, out of this negativity and gloom and hardship, is it some form of test of our integration? I don't know.
Okay, the gentleman there again.
As a white English middle class straight Christian young male, I'm interested in passionately about socialist issues such as Islamophobia, racism, homophobia. I'm often told these things are not my fight. Being berated by a gay man for following fake news on Twitter and things like that. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, it's all about fight, because I think some of these issues are to do with universal principles, and they're to do with human rights issues. And I think it's very important to understand. And what's interesting about the American context, sorry to refer back to my piece again, but what's interesting about what's going on in America, which is different to what's going on in Europe, which is American Muslims are using the values and traditions and history and culture of that country to fight their fight. When they come up, when Park 51, the project, the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, is being attacked, they don't come back and say, you're picking on us because we're Muslims, we deserve to have an Islamic centre, why don't you pick on the synagogue and the church and you're picking on us? No, their response is, what about the First Amendment? We are American citizens, we have the right to freedom of worship. And when you frame the debate in that manner, it's not about them and us, it's not about Muslims versus non-Muslims, it's about universal principles, it's about constitutional principles, it's about human rights and civil liberties. And I think that's very important in this context. And what I would say, and thank you very much if you do care about these issues, you do follow these issues, you do support these issues. What I would say to the Muslims in the room is, how many Muslims in the room are following issues that are non-Muslim issues? One of my criticism of Muslims in this country is that we only get worked up about human rights and civil liberties issues when it affects us. You won't find many Muslims on pickets and marches for Burma or Tibet or other issues, which also are universal issues. And that's one of my own personal hobby horses of criticism of British Muslims. But you're right, all of these issues have to be looked at in the whole. They have to take a step back and look. That's why I said earlier, it's not just about Muslims. When I look about the media demonization of Muslims, it's not just about Muslims. Muslims are the most prominent and obvious example, but it's also about immigrants, it's also about asylum seekers, it's also about Roma, especially in France right now. These are all interrelated issues. You can't just separate them off and say, you fight, your fight, you fight, your fight, you fight, your fight. It depends what your vision of the good society is.
Mr. Ibrahim?
Same question as what the-
Okay. Yeah. The person in front of the line.
I was wondering to what extent you consider the Tea Party to be an explicit racist movement. We see the links
Yeah.
or if it's kind of more a kind of revival of multiple rage and finding scapegoat like John Wallace.
It's a very interesting question. I forgot to mention the EDL in my own talk, but you know, the English Defence League is a very ugly manifestation in this country of this new anti-Muslim which is much cleverer. It's not as crude and hostile as the BNP. It makes it very clear we're not opposed to Islam. We're opposed to Islamism. We're opposed to Sharia. We're opposed to Islamic law, Islamization, etc., etc. And actually, they are pretty much every newspaper investigation, the Guardians at the time, have exposed them as kind of ex-football thugs and BNP members. And some of the rhetoric that's used, you know, you're going to burn in hell, etc., all of you Muslims on rallies, and colleagues of mine have been on, are pretty clear. So, but yes, they have forged links with the Tea Party. They've forged links with Pamela Geller, who is the main right-wing blogger behind the anti-mosque movement in New York and across the United States. It's weird, and I would argue that supports the thesis of those of us and who believe that the Tea Party is fundamentally a kind of a racist, if not crypto-fascist group. Because there are some people who say, oh no, that even on the left, who say, well, the Tea Party, no, you're misunderstanding. There are different strands, and there's authentic libertarians, and there's grassroots anti-tax movements, etc. They may be, but fundamentally, most of the surveys that have been done on the Tea Party show that their attitudes are deeply reactionary and are of the far right, not the centre right, not even George W. Bush right. I mean, what's really worrying about the Tea Party and Republicans is you look back and you think, God, George Bush wasn't that bad. That's what you look at when you look at the current crop of Republican and Tea Party politicians. You look back and you think, I yearn for George W. Bush. He was a politician who, after 9/11, let's give credit where credit's due, I despise George W. Bush, but after 9/11, the man went to a mosque and said, we are not at war in Islam, and Muslims did not carry out 9/11. It was a bunch of terrorists who perverted the religion. Now you have politicians like Newt Gingrich who say, no, Muslims carried out 9/11. Muslims are like Nazis. We wouldn't allow Nazis to build shrines at Pearl Harbor, etc., to Japanese, so why do we allow Muslims to build Islamic centres? So the rhetoric has deeply changed. And the Tea Party, I mean, you look at the number of people in the Tea Party who believe Obama is a secret Muslim, who believe Obama was, I mean, Pamela Geller, who's one of these leading bloggers, she's written a book called The Post-American Presidency. She believes that Obama is the illegitimate love child of Malcolm X. That's his Islamic heritage. She believes she can prove it. I mean, this is a kind of craziness. And when I confronted her on this, she said to me, oh no, I don't believe he's a secret Muslim, but I do believe he's in hock to a socialist international Islamic agenda. And this is Obama, who shamefully has never been to a mosque in his 2 years in office, has not stepped foot in a mosque, despite it's weird, because he's so paranoid about being seen as a Muslim. In fact, he's not even going, according to the Indian press, when he goes to India, he's not even going to the Golden Temple, the Sikh shrine in Amritsar, because he's worried that if he goes there, he has to cover his head in a turban, and he'll be represented as a Muslim back home in America. This is a kind of crazy rhetoric and extreme that American public life and the public arena has reached. I do think the Tea Party has now jumped on this Islamic issue. Republican politicians have now, in 2008, the midterms, we'll see what happens next week, but a lot of these people are running on a crazy platform. I mentioned Mark Williams, who talked about the terrorist monkey, but there are lots of, there's a lieutenant governor, I can't remember which state, who says that Islam is a cult, therefore it should be denied the protections of the Constitution because it's not a religion. I mean, some of the rhetoric, Sarah Palin, we've heard about some of her rhetoric about the mosque stabbing us in the hearts, and Muslims should, quote, repudiate it. So some of the kind of crazy stuff that's coming out of there, and the links with the EDL just kind of, I would argue, kind of seal the deal. That this clearly is a far-right group that is interested in using Islam as rather than Europe to get votes in America. And again, America deeply insecure right now, and they go through these paranoid moments. You go back to Goldwater, you go back to the John Birch Society. America has a history of paranoia when it comes to minority communities in their midst, especially in economic downturns.
Okay, I do not know who raised the hand first, but gentleman at the end.
All right. I have a question to ask. I know it happens in some countries. What do you think, in the spirit of tolerance, which law should they follow? Let's say, in case in the future, somebody like say, should Sharia law run in parallel with, let's say, the Constitution? What do you think of this? Should there just be Constitution, or say, in the spirit of tolerance, there should be Sharia law as well?
Well, there are already Sharia courts in Britain that run. I mean, there's a whole